Hey guys, welcome to Elevated Systems. I'm your host CJ, and today we're building a PC with a very specific purpose. And when planning this build, I had some specific criteria I wanted to meet. The purpose of the PC is for video editing, and the two main goals were that I wanted the system to be quiet and I wanted it to be affordable. So let's get right into all the pieces and parts, and I'll explain how and why I selected all of this stuff. And I'll start with the affordable side, and I guess I should use air quotes when I say affordable because affordability is in the budget of the beholder. Now, most editing systems you see assembled on YouTube are $2,000, $3,000, or $6,000 systems. And those are great systems which can handle 4K RAW, ProRes, or RED footage with full resolution live playback and blazing fast render output. However, the average amateur or hobbyist video editor just needs something to edit 1080p or 4K compressed MP4 footage from their cell phone or mid-range camera. So that was my target use case, and my target budget was $1,000. That's why I say affordable, because $1,000 ain't a tiny chunk of cheddar, you know what I'm saying? But relative to editing workstations, it's on the low end of budgets. Another goal was to pick parts that are readily available at MSRP or below at the time of filming. If you're watching this video a month or a year from now, who knows? I also wanted to make sure the system was in the middle of the road as far as upgrade or even downgrade path. So the framework of the PC allows you to adjust your budget by selecting less expensive or more expensive core components. So let's look at the framework, and I'll start with the motherboard, and that's the MSI B450 Tomahawk Max. This is a great motherboard, probably one, if not the best value motherboards on the AM4 platform. Great power delivery, loads of features, and can support pretty much any Ryzen CPU that you want to drop in here. And all that comes in at about $114. Now, this one is actually the non-max version because, well, I was able to pick it up used for about 80 bucks. But I've included links to the max as well as links to all these components below. And this board will perform exactly the same in this build as the max version. Next is the storage, and like most of my builds, I'm going with dual drives. A 256 gigabyte Sabrent Rocket M.2 NVMe SSD for my boot drive that'll hold my operating system and applications, and a 1 terabyte SanDisk 2.5 inch SSD for my Scratch/proxy drive. This drive will ingest all my project files and footage and have the project folders for rendering proxies to. Now, before I get to the core components, let's talk about my second goal, and that's silence, which after sitting next to my main editing workstation for about a year, I can tell you silence is very important for video editing. Now, I love the speed and efficiency of my workstation, but with a 32 core Threadripper and a RTX 2080 Ti, it's loud. So when planning to build a quiet PC, there's only one company that immediately jumps to mind: Be Quiet. I mean, it's the name of the company. So I reached out to Be Quiet, and they very generously sent me some products that will definitely help keep this PC whisper quiet. First is their Straight Power 11 650 watt power supply. This is a very efficient 80 plus gold rated, fully modular and quiet power supply. Now, this PSU doesn't have a 0 RPM fan mode, but because of its high efficiency, completely wireless internal design, all Japanese capacitors, and the Be Quiet 135mm Silent Wings 3 fan, and the fact that you can buy this PSU right now for under 120 bucks, it's perfect for this system. Now, admittedly, 650 watts is overkill for this system as I'll build it. I can get away with the 450 watt bronze rated PSU I have on the shelf back there, but that one's loud and doesn't fit my upgradability goal. If I upgrade the core system, I also have to upgrade the power supply if I go with a lesser one. The next component is the Dark Rock Slim CPU cooler. This is a quiet, compact, and efficient cooler with a TDP rating of 180 watts. It can cool pretty much any CPU I want to use, and with the 120mm Silent Wing 3 fan, it does it very quietly. Again, the CPU I'm using, which I'll get to in a minute, comes with a perfectly capable cooler, but it has a small fan that spins really fast, so it's loud. Now, at about $60, this cooler is at the upper end of, I guess, the justifiable end of the budget. So I'll also include a link for a less expensive but comparably performing with a 120 watt TDP Pure Rock Slim. The final part that Be Quiet was gracious enough to send me was the Pure Bass 500. Now, I've built a system, or well, 3 in the Pure Bass 500 DX, which is the high airflow focused version of this case. This is the quiet focused version. And to do that, the case has sound baffled panels on 4 sides, front, top, left, and right. Now, admittedly, this case does trade airflow for quietness, but I will be doing some things during the build to improve airflow and cooling. But first, let's look at the core components. All of this stuff was the framework for a quiet editing PC. The framework allows for dozens of options or combinations of CPU, GPU, and memory configurations, but let's look at the combinations I picked. First, the CPU I'm going with is the Ryzen 5 2600 6-core 12-thread processor. But full disclosure, this isn't the Ryzen 5 2600. Well, it is kinda. This is the Ryzen 5 1600 AF. Now, I've done a couple videos on this CPU, and if it was actually available at the $85 launch MSRP for more than like a week, I'd definitely be recommending it. But you can't buy these anymore, so I'll be tuning it in this build to the exact performance of the 2600, which is essentially what it is. You can check out my earlier videos if you want more info, but the 2600 is available for under $150 and is really the perfect balance of cores, speed, and cost for this system, which is a difficult trinity to balance sometimes. For memory, I've gone with a 16GB kit of Corsair Vengeance LPX at 3200 MHz CL16, which is the sweet spot for a Zen Plus CPU. I usually always go with this memory kit for first or second gen Ryzen builds because it works. I've never had a problem with compatibility at its XMP profile. This is because it uses Samsung B DRAM, which is probably the best DRAM module for Zen and Zen Plus. Now, for standard 1080p and even light 4K video editing, 16GB is a good starting point, but the first thing I'd recommend upgrading, especially if you're using the system solely for 4K editing, is jumping up to 32GB of memory, which you can do right now for right around $100. Now, the final component is the biggest change I've made to my recommendations to editing PC builds, and that's the graphics card choice. Until recently, if you were a Premiere Pro user, GPU choice wasn't really too important because the software didn't take advantage of the hardware. That's changed now because Premiere Pro is now CUDA aware and can use the GPU not only for hardware acceleration within the timeline, but can also use the NVENC encoder to encode or render the final output. So now the GPU matters. For this build, I went with the GTX 1660, the vanilla 1660, not the Super or the TI. I went with an NVIDIA GPU because, well, CUDA matters. AMD cards are great for gaming and can trade blows with NVIDIA cards in this range. But as far as video encoding and hardware acceleration, AMD unfortunately just isn't there yet. I also picked the 1660 because not only is it built on the Turing architecture, it also is the lowest tier GTX card that has the new significantly improved Turing NVENC encoder, as opposed to its Volta predecessor. This hardware acceleration and encoding is why we're able to use a more affordable CPU. In fact, this system, after I build it, will probably render a video out maybe 3 times faster than the older version of Premiere Pro using, say, a Intel 9900K and software encoding with QuickSync. The lack of hardware acceleration in Premiere Pro is actually why I switched to DaVinci Resolve as my editing software of choice years ago. Well, that was one of the reasons. The ridiculous subscription fees, constant crashes, crazy bugs. Anyway, enough of that. I need to build and test this system, and then I'll give you my thoughts and go over some specific upgrade paths you can choose for this system. So let's get building. So, mission more than accomplished. For the first time in a while, I actually pretty significantly underestimated the performance of a system I built. This PC outperformed my expectations. Now, admittedly, that's because it's been a couple years since I've used Premiere Pro, and this was the first time I ever used it with CUDA acceleration, and the software only crashed on me once. But in fairness, that was during a Puget benchmark run, and that benchmark is on the upper end of what this system is designed for. However, I did edit the whole first part of this video on this system. It handled the 1080p 60 FPS and 4K 30 FPS footage from my Lumix G7 with no problem at all. Flawless real-time timeline playback, and I could scrub the timeline as fast as I could move the playhead. No stutters or pauses, it was totally smooth. As far as rendering, the about 12-minute video, which included some light color grading and sharpening, transitions, and warp stabilization or retiming on every clip of the build montage, rendered in about 3 minutes using the GPU's NVENC encoding. This ended up being about 150% faster than rendering it just using software encoding. Now, there are limitations to this system, and I'll get to that, but first let's talk about my other goal, building a quiet system. And again, I underestimated how quiet this system would actually be. I did do a couple things to improve the airflow in this case. First, I removed the filters behind the front panel. These filters are pretty redundant anyway, as the filter mesh is the same size as the outer mesh, while the frame is more restrictive. I also added 2 more Silent Wing 2 fans. I actually borrowed these from my 500DX case, but they only cost about 12 bucks each, and I had more than that left in the budget. I put one of the fans in the front as a second intake and the other on top as a second exhaust fan. Now, I'm not using the fans to move more air in the case. They're moving the same amount of air, they're just doing it more quietly. Having more fans, I'm able to set the fan curve RPM much lower. So instead of the case fans moving at about 1000 plus RPM, I have them set to max out at about 600 RPM. How does this translate into noise? Well, the noise floor in the Geek Cave is about 41.8 decibels, which is average for a quiet urban environment. When I first turned the system on, the reading on my sound level meter didn't even move. At idle, the sound level of the PC is so far below the 41.8 decibel sound floor, my meter isn't sensitive enough to differentiate it, which means it's probably under 25 decibels. At a full AIDA64 stress test load, my sound level meter only jumped up to 42.8, which means the isolated noise from the PC is only 35.9 decibels, not 1 decibel. I've seen reviewers just subtract the background noise from their readings and call it the noise level, or not factor out background noise and just use the reading from the sound level meter. That's not how it works. There's math, it's logarithmic. It looks like this. Plug your background noise reading and total decibel reading into the formula and you get the actual noise level of what you're trying to measure. Noise surveys was something I used to do in my former life, and this PC makes the industrial hygiene tech in me happy. The loudest thing in the system, as expected, is the GPU, but after tuning its fan curve, it's still the loudest thing, but it's not the fans. Instead, it's the GPU coil buzz that I can hear if I get this close to the rig. I sat about this close while editing and I couldn't hear the system at all for the most part. The only time I heard anything were the GPU fans slightly ramping up when I applied a heavy GPU effect like a warp stabilizer. This system is actually running right now. So what does all this quietness mean for temps? Well, at idle, they're great, but the CPU cooler can almost passively cool this CPU at idle. Here are temps at idle during an editing session, rendering, gaming, and when I artificially slam the system with an AIDA64 stress test on the CPU and GPU. Now, 88 degrees Celsius is a bit high for a CPU temp, but keep in mind, you're never gonna slam this CPU with anything like the artificial AVX instructions AIDA64 is hitting it with. And if you do have AVX intensive workloads, I only have the CPU cooler fan set to a max at 80% RPM at a CPU temp of 95 degrees. And with that fan curve, temps with actual workloads are just fine. GPU temps are good too, and again, I have the GPU fan set to max at just 80% at 88 degrees. At the 64 or 66 degrees we see here, they're spinning at just over 50% of max. Now, I was going to add a temp versus noise level chart showing the decibel level at each temperature, but the only instant where I got readable noise levels was the 35.9 decibels during the synthetic stress test, and it got up to 34.2 decibels during gaming. Just for some reference, my co-host Frank back there generates about 35 decibels. The main goals of performance and quiet definitely achieved. So next, I want to quickly talk about upgrades as well as downgrades. So first, if you really only plan on editing 1080p footage, you can save some money by stepping down to a 4-core CPU, something like a Ryzen 3 3100, or even going with Intel, something like the 9100F on the B360 or B365 platform, or the newer i3 10100F on the B460 platform. I have a build coming up with this CPU, so make sure you get subscribed for that. As far as graphics cards, stepping down from the 1600 will mean you don't get the improved Turing NVENC encoder, but even stepping down to the Volta encoder is still a huge improvement over software encoding. So you'll still get great 1080p editing experience with, say, a GTX 1650. And if you can find an older GTX 10 series on the used market for a good price, that'll work too. Now, if you have a bit higher budget and your workloads lean more towards 4K editing, then again, the first upgrade I recommend is jumping up to 32 gigabytes of memory. The second recommendation is upgrading your GPU to a card with 8 gigabytes of VRAM. The one thing that this system really had trouble with is high bitrate 4K footage with heavy GPU effects applied. I couldn't complete the Puget benchmark because of this, as it just couldn't render the heavy GPU effect 4K red cinema footage. Now, it did handle high bitrate 4K footage without the added workload of the GPU effects. 6 gigabytes of VRAM just isn't enough of a buffer to process that workload, and render exports would fail due to the lack of memory capacity. So, if you're editing footage from a $4,000 plus camera, stepping up to a RTX 2060 Super for those workloads will work good. You can go as high as an RTX 2070 or 2070 Super, but for 4K editing, that's about as high as you need. You won't see much of a difference in Premiere Pro anyway, between an RTX 2070 Super and like a RTX 2080 or 2080 Super. I won't get into the new RTX 3000 series until they're actually readily available. I mean, the RTX 3070 was just released about, 4 hours ago at the time I'm filming this. I was up, phone in one hand, F5 key in the other. I didn't even see one in stock. They went straight from coming soon to sold out. All right, where was I? Yeah, as far as CPU, again, it's now less important than your GPU, kind of like gaming, but there are still CPU dependent effects, and if you use After Effects a lot, a faster CPU is beneficial. So again, that balance of speed, cores, and cost is always tricky, but I'd say the best value CPU is the Ryzen 5 3600. Still 6 cores and 12 threads, but faster cores and threads. So for 1080p or lower bitrate 4K video editing, the system I built here is perfect. If you're just doing 1080p, you can go with the Intel 10100 or 10100F. I picked this over the 3100 because it's, well, cheaper, faster, and more readily available. And for a GPU, a GTX 1650. For higher bitrate 4K, I'd recommend the Ryzen 5 3600 and an RTX 2060 Super. I'll put links to all those components in each of the configurations in the description below. Finally, I may title this video as an editing/gaming PC build because a good editing PC is also a good gaming PC and vice versa. So I did run just a few gaming benchmarks, and this system did perform as expected, delivering a great 1080p gaming experience. And just as the NVENC encoder is great for hardware rendering videos, it also works great for capturing or streaming gameplay from OBS, offloading the workload from the CPU so you can stream your gameplay with virtually no performance impact on the system. So there it is, an all-in-one whisper quiet editing, gaming, streaming system for under $1,000. Again, a huge shout out to Be Quiet for providing some great components for this project. Let me know what you guys think. Is having a quiet system important to you? And more importantly, is spending a bit more for that silence worth it? If not, where would you reallocate that money in this system? That does it for this one, guys. I hope you learned something. That is why I do what I do. If so, make sure you hit that like button, and as always, the best way to support a small channel like mine is by subscribing. I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, stay safe.